CSS is amazing, but you might think it doesn't change much because the CSS you wrote 10, 20, even 30 years ago all still works the same today. I mean, if you wanted to, you could still lay out a page with table. I'm here to tell you that it does change though, and for the better, with lots of new techniques coming out in the last year, including a new way to center a div. In all of the demos I'm going to show you, no JavaScript is involved in the styling, it's all CSS and HTML. Let's jump right in. First up, did you know it's now possible to create a popover with just HTML and CSS? No more need for that popper.js stuff that we used to use. To do it, we need a button to act as our trigger, and then a div to act as the popover. You can see in my demo, I have a subscribe button, something you should definitely click, and then I want to say thank you when you do go ahead and click it. So how do we make this a popover? Well, to make the div the actual popover, all we need to do is give it the attribute of popover, and to make the button trigger the popover, we need to give it the attribute of popover target, and that needs to target the ID of the actual popover. So you can see we put in my popover there. If I go ahead and save this, and then I click the subscribe button, you can see it now acts as a popover, and it has support for hitting escape or clicking away to make sure it's closed. But how do we go ahead and add in some animations to this? Well, for that we could use translate and transition, but there's going to be a bit of a catch for this, but luckily CSS has added something new to help us out. So as you can see here in my popover attribute, I have a translate of -22 rem. So that's handling making sure that it shows up off screen. Then when the popover is open, we want to translate it back to its original position of 0, 0. And then I just have this transition here to handle the sliding in and sliding out. So if I go ahead and hit the subscribe button here, you can see that it didn't actually animate. But if I click it to close it, you can see that it is animating off of the screen. That's because when this has its first style update, it actually jumps straight to translate 0, 0. We don't have any way of telling it that it should start at -22 rem. At least we didn't until @starting_style came about in CSS. @starting_style here is used to define the style for an element before it receives its first style update. Essentially, we can use it to create our nice entry effect without having to use JavaScript. So now if I add in this @starting_style and then within it, I go ahead and say when the popover is open, we want to start it from -22 rem. If I click the subscribe button over here now, you can see we get that nice entry effect of it sliding down. Anything inside of starting styles applies when it's first rendered to the DOM or when its display goes from none to visible. There is one catch that you want to watch out for though, and that's to make sure that the starting style rule is always after the original rule in your CSS file. Otherwise, the original is simply going to override it. So I've moved this starting style rule here to above this popover open one and hit save. You can see if I click subscribe over here, that effect goes away because this translate 0, 0 is overriding it. So you need to make sure that it's always underneath that original rule. Here's a simpler demo of the starting style then. If I go ahead and click this add div button, you can see we get some squares added that fade in from yellow to red. And the way we're able to do that is we have a transition of background color that lasts half a second, but then we have the original value on the div is red, and then we can go ahead and apply a starting style, so before it gets its first style update, and we can say that we want the background color to be yellow. With that combination, you can see we can get a really nice transition. Essentially, starting style is just saving us from having to write the JavaScript that we previously would have to handle things like entry animations. Another new component you may have seen is the details component. Essentially, in its simplest form, it allows us to make accordions, but CSS has added some new tricks that make it super powerful. As you can see here, in its simplest form, we just have a details component, and then inside of this, we have the summary, which is the text that shows up all the time, and then inside of that, we can have a details content wrapper, and mine just goes ahead and contains some lorem ipsum. You can see if I click item 1 here, it expands and shows us the lorem ipsum. Then if I click item 3, same thing happens, but it handles closing the item 1 for you. Now remember, there's no JavaScript involved in this is all HTML and CSS. What was recently added though is the ability to use the display property on the details component, allowing for horizontal accordions, but it's super powerful. In this new demo, you can see we could already get close to a horizontal accordion, and that was by applying flex and flex row to the actual accordion wrapper. But there's actually a few issues when we did this, as we were limited by the styling options inside of the actual details component. You can see if I expand this, that the summary, which is this emoji up here, is going to always take up this box here, and then the details had to be underneath. We couldn't set a flex property on that. Well, luckily now we can. So if I head over to the CSS, we can go ahead and add in display flex and then flex direction row on our actual details element here. And you see it's going to look much better where now the item or the summary takes up this whole column here. And then the separate details bit can take up this column. So it just looks a lot cleaner and it gives you way more flexibility for styling out your accordions. So you can see we can create some really cool accordions with this new ability. Going back to the simpler demo, the other new feature CSS has to help us out with these details elements is this new details content pseudo element. You can use this pseudo to control the part of the details disclosure that expand and collapse. Essentially, all children of this details element get slotted into that pseudo element, except for this summary here, as that's the part that should always be visible. Everything else should be expandable and collapsible. We can use this pseudo element to make some really cool transitions though. So you can see here in my CSS, I target the details content pseudo element, I give it a transition, and then we start off with a height of 0. But then when the details element has the open attribute, we go ahead and set the details content pseudo element to have a height of 300 pixels. This is what handles adding in that really nice slide in transition when we click on each one of these items. But you can see we're having a bit of a problem here with item 1 and item 2. And that's because I need to know the height to actually transition to. We couldn't transition to height auto. Well, at least we couldn't until now. What I mean by this is if I set the final height of our pseudo element to be auto here, we're going to see the old behavior. So if I expand or close one of these items, you can see it jumps straight to that auto height. There hasn't been a way to transition from a height of 0 to an intrinsic sizing keyword like auto. That is until now when we have the interpolate size option. With this feature, you do need to enable it either on the element or the root. I think the best way is to enable it on the root. So if I go to the top of my CSS here, I can paste in this root and then we say interpolate size and allow keywords. Once we have that, you can see that we get a nice animation between 0 and our automatic height. This is also going to work for keywords like min content, max content, and fit content. And it also even works when we use the calculate size function. The other value that you can use for interpolate size is numeric only. That is the old behavior and also the default. I'm assuming the reason you have to enable it like this is for backwards compatibility. Another cool demo of this, here I have a list of anchor tags that show an icon. You can see as I hover over it, it transitions from the icon size to the max content size, and you can see that is different from each of these tags. We check out the CSS for this, you can see I've enabled the interpolate size allow keywords on the entire root of the document. Then all we have to do now is transition our width, and we can say when we hover over it, just transition to a width of max content. Previously, we would have had to try and work out this width with JavaScript, or we would have just set a specific number value. So you can see how useful this is going to be. We finally have a way to animate our height or width to a value like auto or any of the keywords. It's honestly been one of the most requested CSS features, so this is super cool to see. Another highly requested feature was content-sized input fields. Previously, we either had to guess the size of the input that we wanted, or we'd use JavaScript to count the characters and then adjust the height or width based on that. Now it's a CSS one-liner. So here you can see the old behavior. If I go ahead and paste in a load of text into my text area here, it has a fixed width and height. It's not growing to match our content. Same thing happens with our select here. If I hit high, it's not going to shrink to the actual size of high. It has a fixed width. Same thing happens with an input and also the file input. If I go ahead and adjust my CSS now on text area, select and input, we can go ahead and set field sizing to content. Once that's set, if I save this and then we paste in all of that text again, you can see that my text area is growing to meet the content now. And the same thing happens with all of these. If I select high, you can see that the select is shrinking and my input is also growing. Super useful. Now, I'm sure you don't want your inputs to infinitely grow, but remember you can still set the max height and max width. It's super cool that we now have the ability to size our inputs based on the placeholder or the content value. In my use case, I think it's going to be really useful for our text areas, not so much for the inputs. Another cool one-liner that I can tell is going to have some really powerful uses is paint order. As you can see here, I'm trying to create some really cool text, but it has a few issues. First, on the P, you can see that the stroke behavior is a bit weird, and then when we have all of the characters bunched up, the stroke is also overlapping. This is because at the moment, the fill is drawn before the stroke, so the stroke always applies on top. Luckily though, the CSS to fix this is now one line. We can control the paint order now. All we need to do is set the paint order here to stroke and then fill. So now the stroke is drawn before the fill and we get a really cool effect. Even cooler than that, CSS now has a new way to handle light and dark mode. That's with this new function here, light-dark. You can see you provide it with two colors, the first one being your light color, and then the second one being the dark color, and this is all controlled based on the color scheme. So if the color scheme is favoring the dark mode, it's going to show the second color, and when it's light, it will show the first color. So you can see that in this demo over here. I have dark mode set to the system, which my system is in dark mode. You can see it's showing me the lime color and the black background. If I go ahead and force this to light by changing the color scheme, you can see that it switches over to show us that hot pink color as well as the white background. This is super cool to finally see, as the alternative was either to try and handle this in JavaScript, or you'd set a dark class on your HTML and then you'd have all of your variables redefined for dark mode. Next, we have a new way to position elements relative to each other. Now this one is going to be super powerful. As you can see here, I have a div with a class of anchor. So this is my anchor and smiley emoji. And then I also have a div with a class of positioned element. And that's just my text that says positioned. This is positioned relative to the anchor in the top right. Now this is done with 4 lines of CSS, absolutely no JavaScript involved. So if I head over to the CSS, you can see in the anchor tag, we define an anchor name, and I've given that the name of tooltip. Then in our positioned element, we give it a position of fixed. We then provide it with a position anchor that matches our anchor name. And then we can go ahead and adjust its position area now. You can see at the moment, I've got it in top right, but you can use tons of values. We could use bottom right, for example. We can change this to bottom left. You can use center, pretty much anything you would expect, but it's so much easier than the old way that we would have done this. Finally, can you believe it? A new way to vertically center a div. So in this demo here, I have the element class applied on my div, and it currently has margin 0 auto to go ahead and horizontally center the div. Then I have the container which the div is within. So if we wanted to go ahead and vertically center this div now, you probably would have jumped for something like flex or grid. And to do that, you would have used align content center. Well, luckily now you can actually just go ahead and use align content center, and it works on block elements now. So you can see we've got a vertically centered div in one line of CSS. So they're my favorite new features. Let me know if I missed any. There was a few more that I could have included, like custom scroll bars, backdrop inheritance, property, Ruby align. So many cool features coming out. I'll actually leave a link to the CSS Wrapped that the Chrome dev team did, which has all of the demos that I just showed you in it. Go ahead and subscribe if you made it this far. And as always, see you in the next one.